Actually, my question really is, what are the triggers? I think that's a good place for us to start this discussion. Yeah, when we talk about gender-based violence, thinking about what could be the thing that triggers people to get into violence, the underlying factors, just for us to start understanding from this very basic place.
Okay, once again, I mean, thank you, Sophie, for that really very comprehensive presentation that you've just made a bit earlier. When I think about when one looks at the whole aspect of, first of all, gender, and I think it's a great thing that you actually defined it. There are different places in which gender is expanding a bit more to accommodate all sorts of other expressions of how people experience and find themselves in the world, which sometimes would lend themselves to some of the interventions that we're going to be describing, that we described a bit earlier. But when you look at what actually happens and why do people end up being violent against each other? I'd like to start perhaps first paraphrasing a quote that the late Professor Wangari Maathai, that wonderful Nobel laureate of ours, who actually was addressing issues of environment, made when she was actually being given, when she went to collect her Nobel Prize, the Nobel Peace Prize. And a question which was put to her on that particular day was along the lines of gender and gender-based violence. And like I said, I'm just paraphrasing this. Essentially, it was, what are your thoughts around all this gender-based violence, this gender violence which is taking place in, well, probably where she comes from, which is much more on the African continent. And how is it that women should be able to respond to this gender-based violence? And her response got me thinking pretty seriously. And she said, I can't remember whom the host was, before we really start fully addressing, being able to fully address the matters of gender violence, you need to think about the social circumstances that people are living in. Look at the circumstances that very many people on this continent are living in. The families, they're living in poor socioeconomic areas. There's little to eat. Education is difficult. Income is never guaranteed. There's hunger. There's difficulties, and there's all sorts of challenges which they face just as a matter of routine in their regular routine daily lives, as they go out to try and perhaps provide for the family as much as is possible. And then they come back home. And some people sometimes say, when you come back home, the hope and the expectation is that you're coming into a place where there's some form of peace. But yet, unfortunately, and it's been also just put across here, home doesn't always provide that, because again, there's hunger in the home. There are children, there's the partner, the wife, who also have all sorts of other needs. And there reaches a flashpoint at which violence supposedly reaction, let me put it like this, reaction is triggered, and that reaction may end up being particularly violent. This does not excuse any of this in any way. Of course not, no. But we're just putting this across from the perspective of, as we talk about gender-based violence occurs within the greater context of a social economic environment, a significant socio-economic environment. We are right now going through COVID-19 and the corona crisis and the curfews and the lockdowns and all sorts of other changes in our regular normal behavior, washing hands, wearing masks, hiding ourselves from different people and keeping away from very many others. Yes, we have had a surge in what has been reported and possibly what has been practiced in the name of gender-based violence. But you may also appreciate over the past few years, gender-based violence has also been increasing. And one of the reasons that has been so is because of our socioeconomic circumstances. Our economies have been very poor, to the point that levels of frustration, flashpoints, are much more accessible in terms of how people will respond to dealing with the challenges they're facing, and subsequently who are going to be, unfortunately, the victims of whatever trigger that may have occurred around them. So just stressing again, our social circumstances are significant stresses, are significant stresses. Once again, I'm not excusing or giving a justification for any of this that we're going on. I'm just giving an overview of what we can appreciate within the general environment in which gender-based violence occurs. Now, secondly, the issues of expectations. Issues of expectations which may be both by the male of the gender and the female of the gender. The male of the gender from the perspective of needing and presumably expecting to be a provider in all sorts of different ways and getting frustrated within the context of provision. And when perhaps asked questions about, okay, so what is it that you brought today? That serving itself as a trigger, therefore, are you therefore challenging me? Are you challenging me and my masculinity, so to speak? And one response is a lashing out in self-defense and to create a protective space around themselves. And again, not an excuse, but an observation, something that one can, again, look at. The expectation can also come from the female side, so to speak, of a relationship. I am in the home, I'm looking after the children, I'm trying to keep the place straight, and I expect this man to come in and bring various things, to provide various stuff, to ensure that I can deliver my services in the context of the home as effectively and efficiently as possible, and nothing comes through. Frustration. Therefore, questions get asked, and sometimes the questions are asked rather more sharply than in a congenial manner. And there may be well reason for that. Children are hungry, people are screaming, the landlord was at the door, their housing has been locked up. And once again, trigger, irritation, expectations, frustrations, lashing out, both sides, leading to conflict within the same. So expectations on both sides also do contribute to that. Thirdly, let's look at perhaps our early childhood experiences. And perhaps when one looks at how people have developed through life, it would seem that plenty of people have actually been fairly traumatized during their childhood, traumatized to the point that they now feel the way to protect themselves is to reach out, lash out, to create a defensive space within which hopefully nobody will penetrate. And this applies to both men and women, by the way. And so you find that some of our relationships are actually very, very tentative, so to speak, and based on supposed acceptance, but with very significant boundaries beyond which or within which others should not penetrate, because people feel extremely vulnerable. And as a result of feeling extremely vulnerable and not being able to accept the vulnerability as something they want to deal with, it is much easier for them to now react and lash out whenever they feel any form of frustration that they may go through. And again, early childhood experiences, that's a whole lecture in and of itself, because there are huge challenges there. The things that we go through between the ages of 1 and 12 and how they affect our personality and subsequently how they relate and interact in the world. Fourthly, normalization of violence in various scenarios. Normalization of violence in various scenarios. We have our culture, we have our tradition. I'm laying off a bit issues of the law per se, but our cultures, our traditions, our practices within our families, within our ourselves, and expectations as a community, as expectations of ourselves as individuals. As a man, am I expected to be violent? Am I, as a woman, how do I express my violence? Or is this justified within our particular community? Are people allowed to beat others in the name of supposed discipline? And how is that controlled? A lot of that has been, has been eroded. The guidelines which supposedly used to provide avenues along which supposedly discipline could happen. But that, like I said, has been eroded. And now there are extreme expressions of the same. We do not have safe places that we can go to appeal should we have any incidents in our homes, so to speak. We live among people who are coming from different ethnic groups. So we don't necessarily have an uncle, we don't necessarily have a grandparent, we don't necessarily have parents around whom appeal can be asked of, so that there can be resolutions within the context of various domestic social situations. Those are not there. Now, and this progresses, like I said, from the individual right through to the family, right through to communities at large, to the end that very many people will watch all sorts of violence taking place and just say, unajua hao wako na mashida zao, as opposed to working towards trying to help streamline whatever it is that's actually going on. We have increasingly become very, very individualistic, not necessarily concerned about what's going on in our neighbor's house or in our communities. Even though there have been efforts in various communities, in various social setups, to try to say, you know, you guys, we need to have a bit more collective responsibility. We need to have standards of what is considered basic minimums in terms of how we interact with each other. But these are few and far between, and they're things that we should be able to try to encourage going forward. Now, even more than that, there are people with disabilities, people who are living with disabilities. And these are a large proportion of our population. And especially in times of stress, like now, persons with disabilities, in their own way, in trying to get themselves heard, maybe trying to raise their voice because they want other people to listen to them, want other people to listen to them and their concerns and needs, or frustrations, like persons who have intellectual disabilities, starting to get stressed and getting out of control in behavior. And what happens? The persons who look after these particular people just become more and more violent towards them in their supposed quest to control them. Now, these are things that are happening around us. I was happy to hear about the issue of safe houses and how they're being developed, the government supported in Makueni. But these are practices that ideally we should be covering across the board, across the country. There literally should be strategies which address those things. And perhaps there are some on this panel who may be able to speak to that. But very quickly, I guess you asked me, where does all this stress come from? These are the different ways, these are the different sources, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. These are the different areas from which stress could arise, triggering various forms of gender-based violence. Thank you.